A police officer discovers a homeless little girl gathering trash with a baby clutched in her arms. What she said left everyone heartbroken. Before we get into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Enjoy the story. Before we begin, take a moment to reflect on what family truly means. It's a word that we often take for granted, a word that brings comfort, warmth, and love. But what happens when family is no longer a source of support? What happens when the bonds that should keep us safe and secure become fragile, and in some cases, almost non-existent? In a world where so many are struggling in silence, it's easy to overlook the stories that might seem too hard to believe. Stories of children just like you, who are forced to fend for themselves, who are abandoned in places where no child should ever be. These stories are not just numbers or headlines. They're real. They're the voices of those who are too young to understand why they've been left behind. But what happens when a child with nothing but their love and sheer determination takes it upon themselves to protect their family? What happens when a young girl, no older than 6, becomes the protector of her infant brother, ensuring he survives in a world that has already failed them? How does a police officer, tasked with serving and protecting, handle a situation that challenges everything they believe about justice, compassion, and the strength of human connection? This is not just another heartbreaking tale. This is a story that will make you think about the power of resilience, the importance of family, and the undeniable bond that can exist even in the darkest of times. It is a story that is bound to break your heart, but it's also a story that will give you hope. So, before we dive into this emotional journey, I invite you to take a moment. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Stay with us until the end, and you'll understand why this story of a homeless child and her baby brother touched the hearts of millions across the world. This is a story that proves that even in the most difficult circumstances, love and hope can shine through. Are you ready to witness the extraordinary strength of a little girl who fought to protect her family and the life-changing journey that followed? Keep reading. You won't want to miss it. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it seemed that way at first. The sky was a pale shade of blue, barely touched by the rising sun, and the streets of the city were still cloaked in the remnants of the early morning fog. The sun's first rays struggled to pierce through the mist, casting a dim glow over the narrow alleys and forgotten corners of Maple Street. It was the kind of morning that carried with it a quiet stillness, a lull before the rush of the day began. Officer Jack Williams, a seasoned police officer who had patrolled these same streets for years, stepped out of his patrol car, the cool October air rushing in with a crispness that made him pull his jacket a little tighter around his body. The city was slowly coming to life, the distant sound of early morning commuters filling the air, but it wasn't the usual hum of busy streets or the familiar chatter of residents on their way to work. The usual noises of suburban life, lawnmowers, kids playing, dogs barking, were absent, as if the city itself was holding its breath. It was in this eerie quiet that Jack's instincts kicked in. He had spent years on the job, navigating every corner of this neighborhood, getting to know its people, its rhythm. But today was different. Today, something felt off. As he walked along the sidewalk, he noticed that the typical hustle and bustle of morning routines were strangely muted, and that unsettling silence only made his senses sharper. Then in the distance, he heard a faint sound. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it tugged at something deep within him, a sound he could never ignore. A cry, but it wasn't the usual wail of a lost dog or the distant shouts of children playing in the street. No, this was something different, something more desperate, more raw. A cry that spoke of pain and fear, of someone who had no one else to turn to. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, he moved toward the source of the sound. The further he walked, the louder the cries became. They were soft, barely audible, but they had an urgency to them that made his blood run cold. Jack's hand instinctively went to his radio, but he hesitated. There was no need for backup yet. He just needed to find out where this cry was coming from and why. As he rounded a corner, he spotted something that made his stomach drop. Behind a row of garbage cans, a small figure appeared. It was moving slowly, almost as if it was dragging its feet, and Jack's eyes locked onto it immediately. The figure was small, far smaller than anyone should be in this part of town at this time of morning. A little girl, no older than 6, shuffled down the sidewalk. Her clothes were tattered, dirty, and far too large for her tiny frame. Her brown hair was matted and tangled, and she looked like she hadn't had a good meal in days. But what caught Jack's breath in his throat wasn't just her appearance. It was what she was carrying. Strapped to her chest, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, was a baby. A tiny, fragile baby, barely a few months old, its cries echoing through the cold morning air. The sight hit Jack like a punch to the gut. His heart ached as he watched the little girl stagger under the weight of the baby, her small arms trembling with the effort of keeping him safe. Jack took a few cautious steps closer, his eyes scanning the area around him. The street was still empty, the only sound now being the faint whimpering of the baby and the soft shuffle of the little girl's worn-out shoes against the concrete. There was no one else around. No parents, no guardians, no one to help them. The girl stopped in her tracks when she saw Jack approaching. Her eyes widened in fear, and for a moment, Jack thought she might run. But instead, she stood frozen, clutching the baby tighter against her chest, her small hands trembling with the weight of her responsibility. Jack stopped a few feet away, trying to make himself appear less threatening. He crouched down to her level, keeping his voice as soft and gentle as he could. "Hey, there, sweetheart," he said, his tone warm but firm. "Are you okay?" The little girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, and Jack could see the exhaustion in her face. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. She was terrified, and yet there was something else in her gaze, something Jack couldn't quite place. It wasn't just fear, it was determination. She wasn't just scared, she was protective, and she was doing everything she could to care for the baby in her arms. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the baby's cries. "Please don't take my brother away. I'm taking good care of him. I promise." Jack's heart sank as the words hit him. He had seen many things in his career, but this was something different. The girl wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a little girl forced into the role of a caregiver, and she was doing her best to protect her baby brother. Jack's chest tightened as he looked at her, realizing the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a child who needed help. It was about 2 kids alone in the world, struggling to survive on their own, with no one to help them. The baby's cries grew louder, more desperate, and Jack realized just how fragile this situation was. He needed to act quickly, but before he could say anything else, the little girl spoke again, her voice shaking with fear. "Please," she whispered again, her eyes locked on his. "I don't know where they went. Mama went to find work. Daddy said he'd be right back." But that was, she paused, counting the days on her small fingers, a lot of days ago. The words hit Jack like a cold wave. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. This was a story of survival, of a little girl left to fend for herself and her baby brother, with no idea where her parents were and no way to reach them. Jack's mind raced as he looked at the 2 of them, trying to process what he was seeing. The girl's name was Sophie, she said, and the baby was Leo, her baby brother. Sophie's grip on Leo tightened as she spoke, her voice breaking as she told Jack how she had been taking care of him, finding scraps of food for him, trying to keep him warm when it rained. It was clear that Sophie was doing everything she could, but it wasn't enough. Leo was sick, and there was nothing more Sophie could do for him on her own. Jack's heart shattered as he listened to Sophie's story. She was a child, barely old enough to understand the full weight of the situation, and yet here she was doing the best she could to care for a baby who needed medical attention. The desperation in her voice was impossible to ignore. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for someone, anyone, to make sure her brother was safe. Jack knew he couldn't ignore this. He had to help them. But as he looked at Sophie and Leo, standing there in the cold morning air, he knew that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. The truth of what had happened to these children was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. and Officer Jack Williams was about to embark on a journey that would test everything he thought he knew about family, justice, and the lengths one person will go to for the ones they love. The early morning calm that had settled over Maple Street now felt unnervingly tense, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Officer Jack Williams, despite his years of experience patrolling the quiet suburban neighborhoods, felt something unsettling in the air. He had been called out on various routine patrols 1,000 times, yet today felt different. The silence seemed to stretch longer than usual, with the streets empty and still. There were no early risers mowing lawns or kids eagerly getting ready for school. The usual sounds of a peaceful community had been replaced by the faintest of cries, something that no professional could ignore. Jack had been trained for many situations. He had seen the worst of human nature, the petty arguments, the robberies, the fights, but nothing had ever prepared him for this moment. He knew that the cry wasn't one that could be ignored, and his police instincts kicked in. As he scanned the empty street, the sound became clearer. It wasn't the kind of cry you'd expect from an upset toddler or a dog that had been left outside for too long. No, this was different. This was a cry filled with desperation, the kind of cry that spoke of a deeper, darker need. It was a cry for help. As Jack's eyes darted back and forth, desperately searching for the source, they landed on a figure ahead. It was small, too small for it to be an adult, and as his gaze focused, his stomach dropped. Standing in the dim light of the early morning was a little girl, no older than 6. She stood by a row of garbage cans, huddled against a broken brick wall, her thin frame trembling. She was clutching something close to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around it like a shield. For a moment, Jack thought she might be a child waiting for a parent, lost in the crowd of daily life. But there was something in her eyes, something that felt out of place. Her wide, brown eyes were filled with an emotion that Jack couldn't place at first, fear maybe, or maybe desperation. The usual bright sparkle of childhood innocence was absent, replaced by a dull, defeated gaze. Her clothes, threadbare and stained, hung loosely on her small body. Her hair, once a warm shade of brown, was matted and tangled, and she looked like she hadn't eaten in days. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck Jack so profoundly, it was what she was carrying. The bundle she had wrapped in a faded blue blanket seemed fragile, almost too fragile to hold, and it was clear that whatever it was, it needed immediate attention. As the girl shifted her weight slightly, Jack could make out the faint sound of a baby crying, its cries soft but persistent. The baby was barely visible, its tiny face covered by the blanket, but Jack could tell by the way the girl held it, the way she protected it, that it was sick. It wasn't just a matter of being hungry or cold. The baby wasn't okay. The tension in Jack's chest grew as he took a cautious step forward. The child looked up at him with those wide, fearful eyes, and for a moment she froze, as if she were deciding whether to run or trust him. Jack knew that the second she bolted, this moment could turn into something much worse. He needed to approach with care, with understanding, but he had no idea what he was walking into. "Hey, there, sweetheart," he called softly, his voice gentle but firm, hoping to put her at ease. "Are you okay?" The little girl didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there, her fingers gripping the baby tightly. The baby's cries were growing weaker, and Jack's concern deepened. He didn't want to scare her, but he knew time was running out for both of them. He crouched down to her level, making himself smaller, less intimidating. He needed to make her feel safe enough to speak, to trust him. Finally, the little girl broke her silence. Her voice, though barely above a whisper, sent a chill through Jack's spine. "Please," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, "please don't take my brother away. I'm taking good care of him. I promise." The words hit Jack harder than anything else. Here was a child no more than 6, doing her best to care for an infant in a world that had abandoned them both. Her words, her desperate plea, rang in his ears. Jack's heart clenched in his chest as he looked at her, trying to process what he was seeing. He had seen children in danger before, but this was different. This was not just neglect or an unfortunate situation. This was a little girl, barely old enough to understand the full weight of her responsibility, trying to save her baby brother from the world that had left them both to fend for themselves. Jack's mind raced as he tried to piece together the story that this young girl was telling him without words. Where were her parents? How had they ended up here, alone in the street, with no one to help them? "What's your name, honey?" Jack asked, his voice still soft but filled with urgency. "Sophie," she replied, her grip on the baby tightening as she adjusted him against her chest. "And this is Leo. He's sick, but I'm going to make him better. I found some food yesterday, and I gave him all the good parts." The determination in her voice almost made Jack's heart stop. Here was a 6-year-old child, acting as the caretaker for an infant, doing whatever she could to protect him, to care for him. It wasn't just the physical act of trying to feed him or keep him warm, it was the emotional weight she was carrying, the immense burden of trying to be the grown-up in this situation. Jack asked her where her parents were, but Sophie's answer was not one he was prepared for. She looked down at her worn-out sneakers, as if searching for the words that might explain her situation. "Mama went away to find work," she said softly. "Daddy said he'd be right back, but that was a lot of days ago." She paused, her fingers trembling as she counted on her small hands. "I don't remember how many. I stopped counting after a while." The words felt like a slap in the face to Jack. A mother, desperately trying to make a better life for her children, and a father who promised he would return but never did. Sophie wasn't just a little girl trying to survive. She was a little girl who had been forced to take on the role of a parent, of a protector, in the absence of the very adults who were supposed to be there for her. The baby, Leo, had become her responsibility, her burden to bear, and the more Jack learned, the more his heart broke for her. The tension in Jack's chest tightened. He couldn't let this continue. The girl needed help, and Leo needed more than just food and warmth. He needed medical attention. He needed to be seen by a doctor before it was too late. But before Jack could say anything else, Sophie spoke again, her voice trembling with fear. "Can you help me save my baby?" The words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. Jack could see the fear in her eyes. Fear that she might lose her brother, fear that she might lose everything she had been holding onto for so long. This was no longer just a case of a child needing assistance, it was a case of survival. Sophie had been thrust into the role of a caretaker far too young, and the situation was now critical. The baby needed immediate medical care, and Sophie needed protection. This wasn't just a call for help, it was a call for intervention, for someone to step in and provide what this little girl couldn't possibly provide on her own. Jack took a deep breath and nodded, making a promise to the little girl. "We're going to help you, Sophie. You're not alone anymore." But as he led them back to the station, Jack's mind was racing. This was just the beginning. Whatever had led to Sophie and Leo being abandoned on the street was far from over, and it was up to him to uncover the truth. This wasn't just about helping a homeless child, it was about unraveling a deeper, more complex story that would challenge everything Jack thought he knew about family, love, and survival. The moments that followed Sophie's whispered plea seemed to stretch for an eternity. Jack's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and yet no amount of experience had prepared him for the emotional weight of this situation. He had been called to countless scenes, each one different, each one demanding a different approach, but this felt different in a way he couldn't articulate. There was something raw, something so heartbreakingly pure in the way Sophie clutched her baby brother, as though he were the only thing left in the world worth saving. The sound of the baby's feeble cries hung in the air, and Jack could feel the helplessness of the situation tightening around him. Sophie, with her dirt-streaked face and ragged clothes, was a child far too young to bear such an immense burden, and yet she was. She was carrying her baby brother on her own, trying to protect him with nothing but a small bundle of hope wrapped in a worn-out blanket. Jack had always known that sometimes the job wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about being human, about connecting with people at a level that went beyond duty. And now, as he watched Sophie stare at him with eyes filled with fear, he knew this was one of those moments. He took a step closer to her, but he knew he had to tread carefully. Sophie wasn't just a child, she was a frightened, vulnerable soul who had been abandoned by the very people meant to protect her. He couldn't afford to rush her. He needed to approach her with the gentleness she deserved, to show her that not all adults were to be feared. His training had taught him how to defuse tense situations, how to protect and guide. But he knew there was more to this than that. This was a delicate moment, one that required a soft approach, patience, and trust. Slowly, Jack knelt down in front of Sophie, lowering himself to her eye level. He wanted to appear as non-threatening as possible, and yet his uniform still made him feel like an outsider. The weight of his badge and his weapon was a constant reminder of the authority he held. But in this moment, that authority was of no use. What Sophie needed was not a police officer. What she needed was someone who could show her kindness, someone who could assure her that help was on the way. And Jack knew that was his job now. "Hey, there, sweetie," Jack said softly, his voice calm and steady. He let the words float between them, gentle as a breeze, hoping to reach Sophie's heart in a way that words alone couldn't. "Are you okay?" The silence that followed felt deafening. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, as if unsure whether to trust him. Her eyes were wide, filled with an emotion that Jack could only describe as a mix of fear and desperation. She looked at him like he was both a savior and a stranger, and Jack could see the internal battle within her. The smallest of movements, tensing her fingers around the baby in her arms, revealed how tightly she was holding on to the only thing that mattered to her in this world. Jack's chest tightened with empathy. She didn't speak at first. Instead, her eyes darted down to the ground as if searching for something, anything, to ground her in this moment of uncertainty. Jack's heart broke a little more with each passing second. This little girl, who should have been worrying about crayons and candy, was instead focused on her baby brother's well-being, on keeping him alive, on surviving a world that had already failed her. Jack waited patiently, never pushing, just giving her space. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew that rushing this could push Sophie away, and she had already been let down too many times. Her trust, her safety, depended on how carefully he handled this moment. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Sophie's hands shook slightly, as if she were beginning to feel the weight of the world pressing down on her fragile shoulders. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice barely audible but carrying the heavy weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking as she glanced up at Jack with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Please don't take my brother away. I'm taking good care of him. I promise." The words hung in the air between them, and for a split second, Jack couldn't move. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the pain behind them. Sophie wasn't just asking for help. She wasn't just worried about the baby's health. She was terrified that someone would take Leo away from her, that the only person she had left in the world would be taken from her, too. Sophie's world, as Jack now realized, was a fragile, delicate thing, held together by her love and determination to care for her brother. And it was all she had. Jack's throat tightened, his eyes stinging with the intensity of the moment. He had seen pain, he had seen fear, but this was something else entirely. This was a child, barely 6 years old, taking on the role of a mother, of a protector, when she shouldn't have had to. Sophie wasn't just dealing with the uncertainty of life on the streets, she was doing it with a baby brother who needed medical help, and there was no one else to turn to. "Sophie," Jack said gently, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm not going to take your brother away. I'm here to help you both. You're not alone anymore." The words seemed to register with her slowly, her eyes flicking up to meet his, searching for the truth in his voice. For a moment, Sophie didn't move. She just stood there, her little body trembling, caught between hope and fear. Jack could see the tiniest glimmer of something in her eyes. It was hope, a flicker of trust, buried deep under layers of survival instincts and fear. It was as if, for the first time in days, Sophie was allowing herself to believe that someone would help her. She let out a breath, so soft it was almost imperceptible, and her grip on Leo loosened slightly. The baby's cries were still present, but now they had a gentler quality to them, as if the baby, too, was beginning to feel the calming presence of someone who cared. Jack gently extended his hand toward Sophie, offering a small but meaningful gesture of reassurance. We're going to get you both somewhere safe, Sophie. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Sophie hesitated, but then, with a look of quiet resolve, she nodded. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Jack took a careful step forward, slowly reaching out to lift Leo from Sophie's arms, his hands careful and steady. He could feel the baby's tiny body shiver in his arms, its cries now muffled against his chest. "Let's get you both the help you need," Jack murmured softly, his words just for Sophie, just for this moment. He wanted her to feel safe, to feel like someone truly cared. As he stood there, holding the baby in his arms, Sophie's eyes followed him. There was something in her gaze now, something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was close enough. It was the understanding that for the first time in a long while, someone was here to help. Someone wasn't going to leave her and Leo to face the world alone. And that, for Sophie, was everything. The weight of Sophie's words lingered in the air, wrapping around Jack like an invisible chain, pulling him deeper into a situation far beyond what he had expected. Sophie's desperate plea, the raw, unspoken fear that clung to her voice, settled in his chest like a stone. "Please don't take my brother away. I'm all he has." It wasn't just a request, it was a desperate cry for help, for reassurance, and for something, anything, to make this nightmare stop. Jack could feel the weight of her words pressing against him, pressing against everything he had learned in his years as an officer. He had been trained to respond to violence, to de-escalate confrontations, to manage situations that were already spiraling out of control. But what do you do when the situation isn't about arresting a criminal or stopping a fight? It's about saving two innocent lives that have already been abandoned by the very people who should have protected them. As he stood there with the baby in his arms, Jack's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had never encountered anything like this before. Children didn't belong on the streets, alone, abandoned, struggling to survive. But here she was, Sophie, a little girl who should have been worrying about toys and school, not about whether or not her baby brother would survive the day. She had become a caregiver, a protector, and yet she was just a child herself. Jack glanced down at Leo, his tiny body shaking in his arms, the frail baby's cries weak and desperate. It was clear that Leo's condition was worsening by the second. Sophie had done her best to care for him, but Jack knew that her efforts, as noble as they were, weren't enough. Leo needed medical attention, and Sophie needed someone to take the burden off her shoulders. But Jack also knew that taking Leo away from Sophie, even for medical treatment, would feel like a betrayal to her. She had already been through so much. She didn't trust anyone, least of all an officer who represented the system that had failed her. Sophie's eyes were glued to Jack as he cradled her baby brother, her small hands trembling as she reached out for him. Her grip on Leo tightened, an instinctual defense, as if she feared that Jack would take him and never bring him back. She was so small, her face so innocent, and yet her eyes held a sadness that was far beyond her years. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't take him." She took a small step forward, her fragile frame shaking, and Jack saw the panic rise in her. "I can't lose him. He's all I have left." The weight of her words hit Jack harder than he expected. He could feel the desperate love in her voice, the kind of love that a 6-year-old should never have to experience. The love of a child trying to hold her world together when everything around her was falling apart. Jack's heart twisted, and for a moment he felt helpless. He wasn't supposed to feel helpless. He was the one people turned to for answers, for protection, but Sophie wasn't asking for protection from a stranger. She was asking for the one thing that, right now, seemed impossible: to keep her baby brother safe. "I'm not going to take him away, Sophie," Jack said softly, trying to reassure her, trying to soothe the rawness in her voice. "I'm just taking him to the hospital where they can make him better. I'm not going to let anything happen to him." But Sophie wasn't listening. Her wide eyes, filled with terror, never left Leo. Her hands reached out, trembling, as if she were trying to pull him back to her. She looked at Jack with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I promised Mama I'd take care of him. I promised. And now you're going to take him away?" The word stung. Sophie wasn't just afraid of losing her brother, she was afraid of failing him. She was carrying the weight of a promise she had no business making, and it was breaking her. She wasn't just a child anymore. She had become a guardian, a caretaker, a mother figure to Leo, and that responsibility had aged her far beyond her years. The love she had for him was fierce and raw, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him, especially not after everything they had already been through. Jack could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Sophie's small body was trembling, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps as the emotions she had kept bottled up began to spill over. She reached out again, her small fingers brushing against Leo's tiny hand, trying desperately to pull him back into her arms. "I won't let you take him," Sophie said, her voice shaky but resolute. The defiance in her tone was like a shield she had built around herself. It was the only thing protecting her from the truth that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't do this alone. She was only 6. She shouldn't have to bear the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. But here she was trying to protect her brother, trying to make things right with nothing but a handful of scraps and her own courage to keep them both alive. Jack could see the fight in her, the fierce determination that radiated from her small form. She wasn't going to let go without a fight. She wasn't going to let him take Leo from her, even if it meant the baby's health would continue to deteriorate. Sophie had been abandoned by the very people who should have protected her, and now she was fighting for her brother's survival with everything she had. "I'm not taking him from you, Sophie." Jack repeated, his voice steady, but inside his heart was heavy. He crouched down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "I promise. I'll take him to the hospital, but I'm not taking him from you. You're his sister, and you're the one who's been keeping him safe. You've done everything you can. You've been so strong." The words seemed to reach her, but just barely. Sophie's eyes flickered with doubt, and Jack could see the weight of her decision weighing on her. For a moment, she stood there, torn between the need to protect Leo and the undeniable truth that she couldn't do this alone anymore. Her small shoulders slumped slightly, and Jack saw the exhaustion in her face. She had been carrying this burden for so long, but she was only 6. She couldn't do it alone anymore. And Jack knew in that moment that it was time for him to take over, to step in, and to help her carry the weight of this responsibility. He gently reached out and touched Sophie's hand, offering her a small amount of reassurance. "You've been amazing, Sophie. You've kept him safe for so long. Now it's time for us to help you, okay? You don't have to do this by yourself anymore." For a long moment, Sophie didn't move. Her eyes searched his face, and Jack could see the hesitation in her gaze. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But trusting adults had never worked out for her before. And now she was being asked to trust him, to let go of Leo and let him take the baby to the hospital. Jack held his breath as Sophie's small fingers loosened their grip on Leo's blanket. The moment felt like an eternity. And then, slowly, Sophie nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "But you'll bring him back?" "I promise," Jack said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. With that, Sophie finally let go of Leo. Jack carefully cradled the baby in his arms, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on him. But as he stood up, he realized that this was just the beginning. The real work was only just starting. Sophie had trusted him, and he wasn't going to let her down. As he led them to the patrol car, Sophie walked beside him, her small body still trembling, but her eyes were filled with a flicker of hope. She hadn't given up on Leo, and she hadn't given up on herself. And Jack knew, as he drove them to the hospital, that this wasn't just about saving a child, it was about saving their family. It was about showing Sophie that, even in a world that had failed her, there were people who cared, people who would never leave her to fend for herself again. The moment Sophie's soft words, "Can you help me save my baby?" echoed in Officer Jack Williams' mind, everything else seemed to fall away. The hospital was still miles away, but the weight of her plea was already suffocating. He had heard countless cries for help during his time as a police officer, but none of them had ever hit him quite like this. Sophie's desperation wasn't just a cry for help, it was a raw, unfiltered plea from a 6-year-old girl who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Her plea for help was not just a call for medical assistance. It was a cry for the one thing she had been denied for so long: safety, security, and the chance to be a child again. The car ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and silent dread. The normally comforting hum of the engine seemed distant, as if the world outside was already slipping away. Sophie, sitting in the front seat, was quiet now, her small hands tightly clasped in her lap. Jack glanced over at her a few times, but the uncertainty in her eyes made him feel as though he was carrying a weight much heavier than he had anticipated. She had trusted him to take Leo to the hospital. She had let go, despite everything she had been through. But what if he couldn't save him? What if she had placed her last hope in the wrong hands? The closer they got to the hospital, the more the reality of the situation began to sink in. Jack wasn't just a police officer anymore. He had become a protector, the one person Sophie had put her trust in when the world had failed her. And now, with every mile that passed, the weight of that responsibility grew heavier. He had to get this right. There was no room for mistakes. Sophie's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, ready to get out of the car before Jack had even stopped it. Her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and hope, and Jack could feel her desperation pulling him forward, urging him to move faster, to act quicker. He wasn't sure how to make this right, but he knew he had to try. As they entered the emergency room, the bustle of the hospital hit Jack like a wave. The sharp sounds of medical equipment, the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses, the flashing lights on the overhead monitors, it was all overwhelming, and yet it felt like a distant hum in the background. All Jack could focus on was the tiny, fragile baby in his arms and the little girl standing beside him, her entire world resting on his ability to get them both the help they so desperately needed. The nurses rushed to meet him, taking Leo from his arms with practiced efficiency. The sound of the baby's cries filled the sterile air of the emergency room, but Jack barely noticed. His mind was still on Sophie, the girl who had been through more than any child should ever have to face. She was standing in the corner now, her small frame hunched with uncertainty, watching as Leo was whisked away to a waiting gurney. The baby was still so small, his body frail and trembling, and Jack couldn't help but feel the immense weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Sophie," Jack said gently, approaching her. He placed a hand on her small shoulder, trying to comfort her despite the fear in his own heart. "Everything's going to be okay. They're going to take good care of him." Sophie's eyes flickered up at him, but her face was a mask of exhaustion and fear. She didn't respond at first, her lips trembling, and Jack could see the inner conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, she wanted to trust him, but the truth was she had already been let down too many times. How could she trust him when so many others had promised her that things would get better, only to leave her alone again? Jack didn't know what to say next. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't equipped with the right words to reassure her that everything would be fine. All he could do was stand there, offering her the one thing he had left, his presence. And then, as if to prove that she wasn't ready to let go of the responsibility she had carried for so long, Sophie spoke. "Is Leo going to be okay?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the intensity of her question made it feel as though she had shouted it. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He could see the hope in her eyes, the glimmer that she still believed in the possibility of a happy ending. He knew he couldn't promise her anything. He didn't have the right to. But he could promise her this. He would do everything in his power to make sure her brother was okay. "We're doing everything we can, Sophie," Jack said, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "They're going to help him." Sophie nodded, but Jack could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. She had been let down too many times, and no amount of reassuring words could change that. But he also knew that the only thing he could do in this moment was keep his word and stay by her side. No one was going to take Leo away from her again. Not if he could help it. As the hours dragged on, Jack found himself pacing the hospital corridors, his mind running through countless scenarios, each one darker than the last. He had seen what happened when children fell through the cracks of the system. He had seen the helplessness in their eyes, the broken trust in their hearts. He didn't want that to be Sophie's story. He couldn't let it be. The weight of his promise settled on him like a physical burden. He wasn't just the officer who had found Sophie and Leo. He was the one who had promised to keep them safe, to fix what had been broken, and that was a promise Jack intended to keep. The hospital staff worked tirelessly to stabilize Leo, but as the hours passed, Jack couldn't help but notice the quiet tension in the air. The nurses and doctors moved with urgency, but there was an unspoken fear among them. Something wasn't right. Leo's condition was deteriorating faster than they had anticipated, and Jack could feel the tightening grip of time slipping away from him. At one point, the head doctor, Dr. Avery, approached Jack with a grim expression on his face. The doctor's eyes flickered to Sophie, who was sitting alone in the waiting room, her small hands folded in her lap, her body trembling with exhaustion. "We're doing everything we can for Leo," Dr. Avery said quietly, his voice laced with a sadness Jack wasn't prepared for. "But his condition is critical. We're going to need to move him to intensive care. We need to prepare you for the worst." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had always known there was a chance this wouldn't end well, but hearing it spoken so plainly made it feel all too real. He nodded, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he couldn't show Sophie that he was afraid. He couldn't let her see him lose hope. "I understand," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just keep doing everything you can." Dr. Avery placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the emotional weight they were both carrying. "We will." As the doctor walked away, Jack stood there for a moment, trying to collect himself. He knew he had to be strong for Sophie, for Leo, but the truth was he didn't know how much longer he could keep up the facade. His mind was racing with fear, with helplessness, but there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't give up on them. Not now, not when they needed him the most. Jack walked back to Sophie, his steps heavy with the weight of what he had just learned. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her body still trembling, and Jack could see that she was on the verge of breaking. "Is Leo okay?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes full of fear. Jack knelt down to her level, his voice calm but firm. "They're doing everything they can, Sophie. Leo's in good hands." But even as the words left his mouth, Jack knew the truth. Nothing was certain. Not Leo's survival. Not Sophie's future. The tension, the fear, the unknown, it was all hanging over them like a storm, ready to break. And in that moment, Jack realized that this wasn't just about saving Leo anymore. It was about saving the one thing Sophie had left, her belief that someone would always be there to protect her. As the hours ticked by, Jack stood watch, the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing second. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain, he would stay until the very end. For Sophie, for Leo, for the promise he had made, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The sterile buzz of the hospital lights seemed to echo in the small waiting room, the air thick with the unspoken fear that clung to every corner. Jack sat quietly across from Sophie, who had been holding onto her little brother's hand for what seemed like hours. The promise he had made to her, to keep Leo safe, to get him the help he needed, was now hanging in the balance, uncertain and fragile. He watched as Sophie's eyes darted nervously toward the emergency room doors every time they opened, hoping for a sign that Leo was getting better, hoping for news that would lift the crushing weight of fear from her small shoulders. But nothing came. The world outside seemed so distant, so far removed from the small bubble of anxiety that had enveloped them both. The steady beeping of the machines in the ICU was the only sound, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and how quickly things could go wrong. Sophie had been so strong, so brave, holding it all together despite everything. But Jack could see the cracks forming in her resolve. She wasn't just a little girl trying to care for her baby brother, she was a child who had been forced into a role she was too young to understand. And now, sitting in that sterile waiting room, with no sign of her brother, she was losing the only thing she had left, hope. Jack had tried to reassure her, tried to offer her comfort, but the truth was he wasn't sure what else he could say. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a miracle worker. He had already done everything he could, but it felt like it wasn't enough. The minutes, the hours, they dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Jack couldn't help but replay the situation in his head over and over again, wondering if there was something more he could have done, something he missed, some piece of the puzzle that he hadn't put together yet. But no matter how many times he replayed the events in his mind, one thing remained clear. This wasn't just about a sick baby and a desperate sister. It was about something much larger. And that realization came when the door to the waiting room opened and a woman stepped inside. She wasn't dressed like the usual hospital staff, but the moment she walked in, Jack knew that this was someone important. The woman had an aura about her, calm, purposeful, but with an underlying sadness that reflected the weight of the world she carried. She was older than Jack, maybe in her late 30s, with short brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and dark circles under her eyes. Her name was Rachel, and she was a social worker. She approached Jack and Sophie quietly, her gaze moving between them as she offered a gentle smile. But it was the sadness in her eyes that stopped Jack in his tracks. This wasn't just about a homeless child and her sick baby anymore. It wasn't just about the brokenness of this one situation, it was about a system that had failed both of them. A system that had left Sophie and Leo to survive on their own, and a mother who, despite her best efforts, had been left out of the equation entirely. Rachel's presence here wasn't just about making sure Sophie and Leo got the help they needed. It was a reflection of a broken world, one where families were torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Rachel sat down next to Sophie, her body language open and non-threatening. Sophie didn't look up at her right away, her gaze still fixed on the door, waiting for news that never came. Rachel cleared her throat softly, but it was Jack who spoke first, his voice low and strained. "We've been here for hours," Jack said, his tone tight with frustration. "I don't understand why there's no word yet. What if we're too late?" Rachel's eyes met his, and in that moment, Jack saw something he hadn't expected, understanding. She had seen this before. She knew what this kind of waiting did to people. She knew what it did to children like Sophie, children who were forced to grow up too quickly, children who had to fight for their survival in a world that seemed indifferent to their struggles. "We're doing everything we can for Leo," Rachel said softly, turning her attention to Sophie. "But I know that's not enough. I know it's not just about his health. It's about what comes next. It's about you, Sophie, and your brother. What happens after this?" Sophie's head snapped up at the mention of her name, her eyes wide and filled with an overwhelming mix of fear and hope. She had been so quiet, so withdrawn, but the way Rachel spoke, gentle yet direct, seemed to finally crack the wall Sophie had built around herself. Her lip trembled, and Jack could see the tears that had been threatening to spill now fall freely down her dirt-streaked cheeks. Rachel reached out, resting a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Sophie, I know you're scared, but I want you to know that we're not going to let anything happen to you or Leo. You're not alone anymore. I promise." But there was something else in Rachel's eyes, something Jack could see but couldn't quite place. It was as if Rachel had already seen the unraveling of a much larger story, one that was going to change everything for Sophie and Leo. "Jack," Rachel said, her voice soft but urgent, "I need to talk to you." Jack stood up, his heart pounding. He didn't want to leave Sophie, didn't want to leave her alone in this fragile moment. But he knew that Rachel had something important to say. He nodded and followed her into the hallway, his mind racing with questions. What could she possibly know that he didn't? "Jack," Rachel started, her voice steady but filled with the weight of something unspoken. "I've been working on cases like this for years. But this one's different. Sophie and Leo's story isn't just about homelessness or neglect. It's about a broken system, a family that's been torn apart by forces they couldn't control. Jack looked at Rachel, his confusion growing. What do you mean? What do you know that I don't? Rachel sighed, deeply, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure Sophie wasn't listening. Sophie and Leo's mother, she said quietly, she's been trying to get help. She's been working with immigration services to bring her family to safety. But something happened, something no one saw coming. Jack's heart sank. What happened? Rachel hesitated, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. Elena, their mother, she's been working tirelessly to make a better life for them. But her immigration status, her paperwork, it's been delayed, held up in a system that doesn't care about families like hers. She thought she was doing the right thing. She thought she was giving them a better life. But no one told her that Michael, Sophie, and Leo's father wasn't able to handle the responsibility. He was struggling with his own issues, his own grief. And it wasn't until it was too late that anyone realized Sophie and Leo had been abandoned. Jack's stomach twisted as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Elena, the mother, had been fighting for a better life, but in the process, she had been torn away from her children. Michael, the father, had been incapable of taking care of them, leaving Sophie to become the caretaker, the protector of a family that was falling apart. And now, they were left with nothing but the broken remnants of a system that had failed them all. It's not just about the kids anymore, Jack, Rachel continued. This isn't just a case of neglect. This is a family caught in a web of circumstances they couldn't escape. A broken system that failed them. The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Leo's health or Sophie's emotional well-being. It was about a much larger issue, one that went far beyond just saving the children. It was about fixing a system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Jack turned away, his mind reeling with the enormity of it all. What can we do? He asked, his voice strained. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. We need to fight for them, Jack. We need to make sure Sophie and Leo don't get lost in this system. We need to make sure their story isn't forgotten. Jack nodded, a newfound determination settling in his chest. He had promised Sophie he wouldn't let her down. And now he understood what he had to do. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a part of something bigger. Something that would change the way they saw the world, the way they saw families in need, and the way they fought to protect the vulnerable. Sophie and Leo are not going to be lost, Jack said firmly. We'll make sure of it. As Jack turned back toward the waiting room, he knew that this wasn't just a case anymore. This was a turning point. For Sophie, for Leo, for Elena, and for the broken system that had failed them all. He wasn't just saving one family. He was going to fight for a change. And he wouldn't stop until that change came. The soft hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights, a constant reminder of the sterile clinical environment, seemed to fade as Jack sat quietly in the waiting room, his gaze fixed on the door. The chaotic bustle of the emergency room, the sound of rapid footfalls and beeping machines felt distant now. In front of him, Sophie sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes red from hours of silent crying. It had been a long night, one that had left both of them physically and emotionally drained. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie's body was still. She no longer looked over her shoulder at every passing nurse, nor did she ask Jack every few minutes if Leo was okay. Instead, she sat there with a quiet, almost resigned expression, as though she was waiting for the world to catch up with the calm that was beginning to settle around them. The promise Jack had made to her to get Leo the medical help he so desperately needed was beginning to take shape. The doctors had managed to stabilize Leo after hours of treatment, his once weak cries now replaced by the occasional coo as he rested in a warm, safe crib. The medical team had worked tirelessly to address his malnutrition and dehydration, but the emotional toll of his illness was far from over. The journey ahead would not be easy for Leo. He would need continued care, rehabilitation, and the time to heal physically and emotionally from the trauma of the last few weeks. But for now, he was safe, and that was a victory. Sophie's expression, however, was less about relief and more about quiet acceptance. Her world had been shaken to its core, And though she had been offered food, warmth, and medical care, the psychological and emotional aftermath would take longer to heal. Her innocence, once free from the weight of such burdens, had been lost in the haze of survival. She was still just a little girl, but now she bore the scars of a battle that no child should ever have to fight. The tension in the room between Jack and Sophie was palpable, yet there was a subtle shift in the air. For the first time, Sophie seemed to trust him in a way she hadn't before. She wasn't looking for promises or empty words. Instead, she seemed to be waiting for something she couldn't quite name, but something Jack could sense. She was waiting for the assurance that things would be different now, that despite all she had endured, she could finally rest. And that in itself was the most difficult promise Jack would have to fulfill. Sophie, Jack said softly, his voice gentle yet filled with an underlying urgency. Leo's going to be okay. You've done everything you could, and now it's our turn to take care of both of you. Sophie looked up at him, her large, brown eyes filled with quiet disbelief. She was still trying to process what had happened, still trying to understand how her world had gone from one of survival on the streets to the uncertainty of a hospital room. But there was something in Jack's voice that seemed to reach her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Instead, she nodded, her head moving ever so slightly, as if accepting that for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. The hospital staff worked efficiently, but their efforts felt secondary to the emotional chaos that had unfolded in the past few hours. Sophie and Leo had become the focal point of a system that for so long had failed them. But now there was hope that things could be different for them, that they could finally have the chance to heal, both physically and emotionally. Jack looked down at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. The message from Rachel still lingered in his inbox, waiting to be addressed. Sophie and Leo weren't the only ones who needed help. He had promised to find out what had happened to their parents, to uncover the truth behind the abandonment that had led to this point. Sophie had told him about her mother, Elena, who had gone away in search of work, and about her father, Michael, who had promised to return, but never did. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still so much left unsaid, so much still left to discover. Jack stood up, his movements slow but purposeful. "I'm going to check on Leo," he said quietly, not waiting for a response. He walked out of the waiting room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he made his way toward the intensive care unit. The hallway was dimly lit, the sharp, sterile light giving the hospital an otherworldly feel. But as Jack stepped into the ICU, the first thing he saw was Leo. The baby was sleeping peacefully in a small crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with each slow, steady breath. A nurse was nearby, monitoring machines that beeped softly in the background, but for a moment, Jack felt a quiet sense of relief wash over him. Leo was safe. He was getting better, and that was all that mattered. Sophie's mother, Elena, was still nowhere to be found. Jack had called the number Sophie had provided, the one that she had said belonged to her mother, but there had been no response. It was a lead, yes, but one that was still shrouded in uncertainty. Jack didn't know where Elena was or why she hadn't returned to her children sooner, but he had to believe that there was more to this story than anyone had yet uncovered. As he stood in the quiet, watching Leo sleep, Jack made a decision. The work was far from over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces left out of the puzzle. Sophie and Leo deserved answers, and Jack wasn't going to stop until he found them. He turned to the nurse, who had been standing nearby, and cleared his throat. "I need to know about the baby's condition," he said, his voice steady. "Is he stable?" The nurse nodded, her face a mix of professionalism and empathy. "He's improving. We've stabilized him for now, but he'll need continued care. His malnutrition was severe, and his lungs are still weak, but we're hopeful that with time he'll recover." Jack exhaled slowly, a deep sense of relief settling over him. "Thank you," he said, turning toward the door. "I'll be back in a little while." As he made his way back to the waiting room, his mind was already spinning with the next steps. Rachel had reached out to him for a reason. She wanted to help. But the system was flawed, and Jack knew it. No amount of compassion could fix the damage that had already been done. But that didn't mean it was too late to change things. The promise he had made to Sophie, to Leo, was only the beginning. Now, he had to make sure that their future was as bright as their past had been dark. When Jack returned to the waiting room, Sophie was still there, sitting quietly. She looked up at him, her expression calm, though Jack could see the faint traces of her earlier worry still lingering in her eyes. They said Leo's going to be okay, Jack said, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. He's strong, Sophie. Just like you. Sophie nodded, her lips trembling slightly as a tear slipped down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't a tear of fear or desperation. It was a tear of relief. And for the first time since Jack had met her, Sophie looked like the little girl she was supposed to be. Not a caregiver, not a protector, but a child who was finally allowed to rest. As Jack sat beside her, he knew that the journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sophie and Leo still had a long road ahead of them, one that would be filled with challenges and obstacles. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. Jack had kept his promise. And in doing so, he had given Sophie and Leo the one thing they had been denied for so long, a chance to heal, to grow, and to be a family again. The sound of a phone ringing interrupted his thoughts. Jack glanced at his phone, seeing Rachel's name on the screen. He swiped to answer, his mind already racing toward the next step in their journey. Jack? Rachel's voice came through the line, her tone urgent. I think we've got a lead on Elena. I need you to meet me at the office. Jack stood up, a new sense of determination coursing through his veins. I'm on my way, he said, hanging up the phone and turning to Sophie. I'll be right back. I promise. As he walked down the hallway, Jack felt the weight of the situation beginning to lift. The work was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, things were beginning to move in the right direction. He was going to make sure that Sophie and Leo had a future, one that was filled with the love and security they deserved. And this time, nothing would stop him from keeping his promise. It had been a week since Officer Jack Williams had first found Sophie and Leo alone on the cold streets, abandoned by the very people meant to protect them. Since then, the journey had been a whirlwind of emotions of doctors, social workers, and bureaucratic red tape that seemed endless. But now, as Jack stood in the doorway of the small foster home, watching Sophie and Leo play together for the first time in what felt like forever, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride settle over him. It was in the little moments like this that hope was rekindled, when the world stopped being a place of uncertainty and became a place where love, care, and safety could finally thrive. Sophie and Leo were laughing, the sound of their joy ringing through the air like a beautiful, unspoken promise that things could get better. Sophie had been so quiet when Jack first met her, so closed off from the world around her. But now she was smiling. It was a small, shy smile, the kind you only see when a child has finally learned to trust again. She was playing with toys, simple things, blocks, a stuffed bear, and a small ball. But for Sophie, this wasn't just playing. It was the reclamation of her childhood, of a time when she was allowed to be a little girl again. Leo, too, seemed to be thriving in this new environment. His cheeks were pink with health, his small hands reaching out to grab at the toys Sophie was offering him. The doctors had done their work, stabilizing him and ensuring that his malnutrition was being corrected, but it was the stability of the home, the sense of normalcy, that was making the real difference now. It was a new beginning for both of them, a second chance that they had almost been denied. Jack had seen countless kids in his career, each with their own story, their own trauma. But none had touched him quite like Sophie and Leo. They had become a part of him in a way he hadn't anticipated. As Jack watched them, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led to this moment. There had been a time, not too long ago, when he felt as though his job was nothing more than a series of responses to incidents, calls for help, investigations, arrests, and paperwork. It was a job, a duty, but with Sophie and Leo, something had shifted. The moment he had walked into that alley and seen them, Sophie, so determined to protect Leo, so willing to do whatever it took to keep him safe, it had changed him. For the first time in his career, Jack had realized that being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing laws or putting criminals behind bars. It was about making a difference in the lives of those who needed it the most. It was about stepping into the gaps where society had failed and showing people that they were seen, that they mattered. And it wasn't just about the kids. It was about the system that had let them down. It was about the broken promises of parents and the indifference of an infrastructure that had allowed Sophie and Leo to slip through the cracks. Jack had seen the scars of that broken system, but he had also seen the healing that could happen when someone cared enough to step in. Sophie had trusted him to keep his promise, to make sure Leo was okay, to find their mother, Elena, and bring their family back together. And though he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose in the knowledge that he had been that person who had stepped in when it mattered. Sometimes it takes just one person to change everything, to give hope where none seemed possible. Jack had done that for Sophie and Leo, and now it was their turn to live that hope. But it wasn't just the children who had changed. Jack had seen the way the foster system had rallied around Sophie and Leo, how the caseworkers, the doctors, and even the social workers like Rachel had worked tirelessly to create a safe, stable environment for them. The love and dedication that flowed through that system, despite its flaws, had made all the difference. Jack had witnessed firsthand the incredible strength of a community coming together to protect the most vulnerable, to give them the chance to heal and grow. As he watched the children play, Jack's thoughts drifted back to Elena, Sophie, and Leo's mother. It had been a long journey to find her, but they had finally located her in California, working hard to secure the proper documents for her family to reunite. The relief he had felt when Elena finally spoke to Sophie, hearing her voice after all the uncertainty, was indescribable. Sophie had spent so many days thinking her mother had abandoned her, believing that no one would come back for her. But the truth was far more complicated. Elena had been working to build a better life for them, trying to overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. Her story wasn't just about abandonment, it was about survival, sacrifice, and the lengths a mother would go to for her children. Jack had seen the pain in Elena's eyes when she learned what had happened to her children. She hadn't known they had been left alone. She had been fighting for a better future, and in her absence, her husband had struggled with his own issues, ultimately failing to care for Sophie and Leo in the way they needed. It was a tragic chain of events, but it was also a story of redemption. Elena had fought to reunite with her children, and now that they were safe, the family had a chance to rebuild. The reunion had been emotional, so much so that Jack could barely keep his composure as he witnessed Sophie running into her mother's arms. Elena had apologized through her tears, but Sophie, wise beyond her years, had told her, "I'm just glad you're back." It had been a moment of pure healing, a moment that had brought hope not just to Sophie, but to everyone involved. As Jack looked back at Sophie and Leo, he felt a renewed sense of purpose flood through him. The journey had been difficult, and there would still be challenges ahead, but they were on the right path now. Sophie and Leo had been given a second chance, a chance that so many children never get. They were safe, they were loved, and now, with the help of the foster system and the community that had stepped in to support them, they could begin to heal. Sophie glanced up at Jack, her eyes bright with the promise of the future. She wasn't the same scared, defensive little girl who had first met him in the alley. She was still vulnerable, but she had learned to trust again. And Leo, though small and fragile, was beginning to thrive in a world where he didn't have to worry about where his next meal would come from or whether he would have a roof over his head. Jack smiled, a soft, knowing smile as he watched them. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be difficult moments ahead: therapy, legal proceedings, adjustments to a new life. But in this moment, Jack allowed himself to feel the fullness of what had been accomplished. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness and compassion could change the trajectory of a life. And Sophie and Leo had been given that gift. They had been saved, not just from the streets, but from a future filled with uncertainty and fear. They had been given the chance to rebuild, to grow, and to be children again. As Jack stepped out of the room, his heart was light. The weight of the world that had pressed down on him during the early days of this case was lifting, replaced with something more powerful: hope. Hope that no matter how broken a system may seem, no matter how impossible the odds, change was possible. Hope that people who truly cared could make a difference. And above all, hope that as long as there were people like Jack and like the doctors, social workers, and foster families who had stepped in to help, there would always be a way to heal even the deepest wounds. Jack had made a promise, and in the end, that promise had been kept. Sophie and Leo were safe, and that was all that mattered. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Sophie and Leo's story is just one example of how hope, compassion, and the support of a community can make a difference in the lives of those who need it most. If you believe in the power of second chances and want to see more stories of resilience and strength, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Share this video to spread hope, and don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts. Stay tuned for more heartfelt stories, and remember, together we can change lives. Subscribe now to HOA Denied Access and be part of a community that believes in the power of kindness. Let's make the world a better place, one story at a time.